Imagine if tomorrow a massive foreign military swept into your country, completely dissolved the centralized federal government, leveled the capital city to ash, and decreed that from now on, the only recognized authority left in the land was your local public librarian.
That is quite the mental image, actually.
Right. I mean, overnight, the entire structural integrity of your society would have to be reinvented on a localized level. You would be relying entirely on whoever held the books and, knew how to teach them.
Yeah, the whole system would flip completely.
And that is precisely the scale of the shockwave that hit the Jewish world in the first century. Welcome to Reform Thinking. Today we are undertaking a deep dive to investigate the origins, the mechanics, and the genuinely surprising realities of religious leadership in the early Christ movement and early Judaism.
Thanks for having me. I am really looking forward to getting into this material.
Absolutely. So our primary source for this investigation today is the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Bible and Gender Studies, Volume 2. Now, when you look around at modern organizational structures in churches or large institutions today, they often feel totally set in stone.
Oh, yeah, they feel completely static.
Right. You see the titles, the flowcharts, the distinct offices, and you might assume it has always looked that way from day one. But examining the historical soil of the first century reveals a much more dynamic, shifting reality.
It was incredibly fluid back then.
It really was. And why should you, the listener, care about this history? Because understanding how early leaders organized their communities completely alters how we view authority, structure, and responsibility today.
Spot on. It changes the entire perspective.
Okay, let's unpack this. We cannot grasp the early Christian structural landscape without analyzing the political shockwaves that preceded it. I mean, the first century did not emerge out of a vacuum.
No, it certainly did not. There's a lot of buildup.
So I want to hand it over to my co-host to establish the 500-year timeline that set the stage for everything we are going to discuss today.
Well, what is fascinating here is how significantly the geopolitical landscape dictated the religious structures of the Jewish people leading up to the first century. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to rewind to the year 538 BCE.
Okay, so way back.
Yeah, way back. This is the period when the Jewish people were returning from the Babylonian captivity under the reigning Persian Empire, and the ruling Persian authorities had a specific administrative strategy.
What kind of strategy?
Well, they categorized the returning exiles not primarily as a distinct political or ethnic vassal state, but rather as a cultic religious community. Because of this external categorization imposed by a massive foreign empire, the leadership structure of the returning exiles had to adapt immediately.
Right, because they are not their own nation anymore,
Yeah.
legally speaking.
Precisely. So at the very opening stage of this return, as noted in the book of Haggai, chapter 1, verse 1, the people were led by two distinct figures. You had a dual leadership model designed to cover both bases.
Okay, so two leaders working together.
Yes. There was Zerubbabel, who represented the secular royal house of David, and Joshua, who represented the religious priestly house of Zadok. The assumption was that the political and the religious spheres would operate in tandem.
But that dual-track system did not last, did it? I mean, having a direct descendant of the Davidic royal line sitting in Jerusalem would be an enormous red flag for the Persian administration.
Oh, a massive red flag. It was totally unsustainable.
Yeah, because a priest managing temple sacrifices is harmless to a foreign empire. But a king with a legitimate bloodline claim to the throne is a constant, lingering threat of rebellion.
You have hit on the precise political calculus of the era there. The secular royal line faded from public authority under the shadow of the empire. Zerubbabel disappears from the historical record fairly quickly, and the Davidic line essentially goes underground.
Leaving a huge gap in administration, I assume.
A massive structural vacuum. And, nature abhors a vacuum. To fill it, the high priestly family stepped up, leading to roughly 360 years of continuous high priestly rule.
Wow, 360 years.
Yeah, the high priest became the undisputed locus of authority. They oversaw the newly built Second Temple in Jerusalem, but their role expanded far beyond theology.
Right, they had to take on the civic stuff too.
Spot on. They conducted all the diplomatic negotiations, managed the economic taxation systems, and functioned as the sole representative of the Jewish people to the ruling foreign authorities. They held the community together through sheer administrative and religious leverage.
That is a staggering block of time for one specific office to hold all the cards. I mean, that is older than the entire history of the United States, just to put it in perspective for you, the listener.
It really gives you a sense of the stability they achieved.
It does. it is easy to see how the priesthood became viewed as the permanent, unchangeable reality of religious life. But that stability fractured because the political ground underneath them never stopped shifting.
Yes. They maintained this singular grip on authority, even when control of the region changed hands in 332 BCE, when the Greeks under Alexander the Great assumed regional dominion. But the situation fractured dramatically around 151 BCE.
What happened then?
Well, this brings us to the Hasmonean dynasty. A high priest named Jonathan from the Hasmonean family assumed control. The Hasmoneans had just won a massive military victory over their Hellenistic overlords, the Seleucids, during the Maccabean revolt.
Okay, so they fought back and won.
Yes, and by achieving political independence, this family did something unprecedented. They combined military, secular, and religious rule into a single entity. The high priest was now simultaneously a warlord and a king.
A warlord priest, that sounds like a contradiction.
It was a huge contradiction to many. This merger of the sword and the altar greatly offended many purist groups within Judaism. For instance, the community at Qumran viewed the Hasmonean priesthood as completely illegitimate because they were not from the proper Zadokite lineage.
So the Hasmoneans essentially monopolized every available form of authority. But any student of history knows that when you consolidate that much authority into a single office, it makes you a very appealing target for the next empire that rolls into town.
And that empire was Rome. This personal union of roles was forcibly dismantled under Roman occupation. When Herod the Great rose to the kingship in 40 BCE, he was backed by the Roman Senate.
And Herod was not a priest, right?
Correct. Herod was an Idumean. He was a non-priest king. To secure his own position, he systematically stripped the high priesthood of its political and military leverage. The high priesthood was forced back into functioning on a purely religious, cultic basis, completely subjugated to Herod's political whims.
He really wanted to make sure they knew who was in charge.
He definitely did. He even went so far as to lock up the high priestly vestments in a fortress, only handing them over on specific feast days, just to prove he held the reins.
That is incredibly petty,
Right.
but also a very clear flex of authority.
It was highly calculated. But then came the most devastating shift of all. In 70 CE, following a massive Jewish revolt, the Second Temple in Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Roman legions.
Just leveled to the ground.
Yes. For the priesthood, this was catastrophic. The temple was the exclusive domain where they officiated. With its destruction, the priesthood lost its entire operational base.
They had nowhere to actually do their jobs.
Exactly. The sacrificial system ceased entirely. The income from temple taxes vanished. They were left with nothing.
Which brings us back to the librarian analogy I used at the start. I mean, the physical, geographical center of their universe is gone.
The anchor was completely ripped away.
Right. Out of that smoking rubble, the entire system had to pivot locally to keep the community from disintegrating. The physical altar was gone, so the text became the new altar.
That is a great way to put it. The focus shifted entirely.
And this gave rise to the study house and the synagogue as the primary centers of communal life. Consequently, authority transferred out of necessity from a hereditary bloodline, the priests, to a knowledge base held by the sages.
It became all about what you knew, not who your ancestors were.
Yeah, leadership was no longer about who your father was. It was about your mastery of the Torah. And this localized, knowledge-based leadership model of the synagogue is the specific environment into which the early Christ movement was born.
It provided the necessary blueprint for them.
But, the synagogue was only half of the equation. We also have to analyze the heavy reality of the Roman world surrounding them. How did this Jewish restructuring, combined with Roman civic life, create the unique crucible where early Christian leadership first sprouted?
Well, this raises a crucial question about the physical and social spaces where religion was actually practiced. We have to look at the Roman religious environment, which was distinctly dual-layered.
2 layers. Let's
Yeah.
break those down.
On one level, Roman religion was a highly public affair. Civic identity was completely tied up in officially designated public leaders, like magistrates, senators, and emperors, managing public rituals and massive state-sponsored sacrifices.
So that is the public square, the state religion.
Yes. But on another level, there was private, everyday devotion. This private religion was strictly regulated by the head of the household, known in Latin as the paterfamilias.
The patriarch of the family.
Yes, and Roman law granted the paterfamilias immense leverage. He held patri potestas, which legally meant he had the right of life and death over his children, his slaves, and his dependents.
Wait, really? The legal right of life and death?
Yes, absolute legal control. The paterfamilias ensured that devotion to the specific family gods, the lairs and patents, was maintained within domestic walls. The social order of the entire empire depended on this domestic hierarchy functioning smoothly.
Okay, let's investigate that living room dynamic, because this is where the history becomes incredibly visceral. Put yourself in that room for a second.
It is quite a scene to imagine.
It is. The early Christ movement emerged right at the intersection of these two worlds by utilizing a network of house churches. So you have a movement drawing heavily from Jewish synagogue models, the local gathering around teaching, reading texts, and communal knowledge. But it is taking place inside Roman domestic spaces.
The clash of cultures there is staggering.
Think about the intense friction of that reality. You have an enslaved person sitting next to their Roman master in a private dining room, breaking bread and sharing the communal cup as spiritual equals.
Which would have been scandalous to Roman neighbors.
Totally scandalous. Yet both of them know that the moment the gathering concludes and Monday morning begins, the paterfamilias structure resumes, and that master retains the legal right to execute that enslaved person without trial.
The psychological weight of that is immense.
It really is. They are blending public communal worship practices inside a private household space where the absolute dominance of the Roman patriarch is the cultural air they breathe. Meanwhile, this movement is expanding rapidly across the entire Mediterranean basin.
Growing very fast in a very hostile environment.
Right. They are dodging competing non-Jewish cults and philosophical schools. And according to the encyclopedia, they are predominantly led by Jewish men, though with notable exceptions. My question for you is this. As they spread from city to city, setting up shop in these volatile domestic spaces, did they implement a rigid, top-down corporate ladder from the start? Or was it just a free-for-all of spontaneous charismatic gatherings?
That specific tension is the core debate among scholars who study this period. To classify and make sense of the text, researchers often use an etic distinction.
An etiquette distinction, what does that mean for the listener?
It is a scholarly categorization brought in from the outside by modern historians to help organize the data. They divide early leadership into two categories.
Okay, what are the two categories?
First, officially designated leaders, which includes apostles, overseers, deacons, and elders. Second, charismatic leaders, such as prophets, healers, and those speaking in tongues. But the lines between these groups were highly porous in reality.
So they weren't neatly separated into two different departments?
No, not at all. Regarding your question about a corporate ladder, the academic community is sharply divided. On one side, you have Andrew Clark. He argues that the early movement actually developed distinct institutional roles quite early on.
So Clark thinks they were highly organized.
Yes. In his view, the house churches were not purely spontaneous, they were the institutional setting, and they required systematic administration. An overseer would lead a specific house church, managing the logistics, often assisted by a deacon who handled the practical distribution of goods.
That makes sense logistically.
Furthermore, if a particular urban region, like Ephesus or Corinth, had several house churches operating simultaneously, a council of elders would meet to provide broader guidance and resolve disputes, though their exercise of authority was meant to be constrained compared to civic magistrates.
So Clark sees a nascent organizational chart taking shape right from the jump, relying on designated roles to keep the regional networks from collapsing into chaos.
Yes, he sees a deliberate structure. But on the other side of the debate, you have Kathy Ahrensberger. She strongly calls the idea of early rigid hierarchies into question.
Oh, interesting. How does she view it?
She rejects the notion that New Testament leaders operated with dominating authority over their congregations. Instead, she suggests they relied on an empowerment discourse.
Empowerment discourse. That sounds very modern.
It does, but her point is rooted in the ancient text. They used kinship models, leading like a father or a nursing mother, which was noticeably distinct from the lethal, dominating authority of the Roman paterfamilias.
Okay, so more relational, less dictatorial.
Right. They also used educational models drawn from Jewish rabbinic teaching practices, where the goal of the teacher is to elevate the student. Ahrensberger argues that this approach to influence directly and intentionally opposed Roman imperial ideology, which always prioritized top-down subjugation.
Well, I am going to push back on Ahrensberger's framework just a bit here.
Go ahead, it is a debated topic.
It sounds wonderful to say they completely rejected all dominating authority in favor of pure empowerment. But when you read the primary source documents, Paul and other writers frequently demand obedience. I mean, they issue commands. They expect compliance.
They certainly use strong imperative language.
Right. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 15 and 16, Paul explicitly directs the congregation to submit to the household of Stephanas and to others who labor with them.
That is a very clear directive.
It is a demand for submission. It might not be a cold corporate org chart, but it is an organized asymmetry. It is a hierarchy based on trust, labor, and the assumption of risk, rather than just spontaneous egalitarian inspiration.
Your pushback is entirely valid and highlights the tension within the texts themselves. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 5 also implies a clear distinction between administrative abilities and general spiritual gifts.
Right, so administration was its own recognized skill.
Yes. While the movement was highly charismatic and prophets could claim direct, unmediated access to divine revelation, it does not follow that every spiritually gifted person was automatically tasked with administrative or structural leadership. We see hierarchically ordered relationships existing right alongside charismatic expressions.
They had to coexist to keep the community functioning.
Exactly. The submission Paul demands in 1 Corinthians 16 is, as you noted, based on the labor and the proven track record of Stephanas' household in assisting the community. It is an authority earned through sacrifice, but it is an authority nonetheless.
So if the local house churches were organizing themselves based on this earned trust, labor, and mutual submission, someone had to set the standard for that trust.
Someone had to provide the baseline.
Yeah. The local overseers and patrons needed a benchmark, a point of origin to legitimize their own local practices. Who were the ultimate standard bearers for this massive, sprawling network?
If we examine the earliest texts, 4 major apostolic figures emerge as the undisputed heavyweights: Peter, James, John, and Paul.
The core 4. Let's look at their specific spheres of influence, starting with Peter.
Well, Peter is pictured throughout the gospel accounts as a prominent member of the 12. He is part of the inner circle, and in the early days of the post-resurrection movement, documented in the first 5 chapters of Acts, Peter is the central apostolic voice in Jerusalem.
He was really the initial public face of the group.
Yes, he participated primarily in mission work among his fellow Jews, a demographic focus that Paul corroborates in Galatians chapter 2. Then you have James, the brother of Jesus.
And James had a slightly different role than Peter, didn't he?
He did. While Peter was active in regional mission work, James eventually assumed the primary, localized leadership of the church in Jerusalem. His role was incredibly politically sensitive.
Oh, I can imagine. Jerusalem was a powder keg.
It really was. He managed the pivotal apostolic council in Acts chapter 15. This council had to resolve a massive theological and sociological hurdle, determining how the influx of non-Jewish Hellenistic converts should relate to the Torah.
That was the breaking point for the early movement.
It almost split them entirely. James had to bridge the gap between strict, Torah-observant Jewish believers and Gentiles who had zero background in Jewish law.
I want to pause on James for a second. We cannot overstate how difficult his position was.
The pressure on him must have been immense.
Truly. He is sitting in Jerusalem, the epicenter of Jewish identity, trying to hold together a movement that is rapidly absorbing outsiders who eat pork and do not practice circumcision.
2 groups with entirely different worldviews.
Exactly. The political maneuvering required to issue a ruling that kept both sides at the table without causing a massive schism requires staggering administrative skill.
It absolutely does. James provided the stabilizing center of gravity. Alongside him, you have John, one of the sons of Zebedee, who also operated as a stabilizing pillar.
The steady hands at the top.
Yes. Paul explicitly describes Peter, James, and John as the undisputed pillars of the Jerusalem movement. But then you have the 4th figure. You have Paul, and Paul is the controversial, disruptive outsider.
Paul's story is absolutely gripping because his resume is, culturally speaking, a total disaster for the role he is claiming.
It was highly problematic for his credibility.
It really was. I love looking at Paul's leadership autobiography, so to speak, in the first 2 chapters of Galatians. Let's look at the mechanics of what is happening there. Paul is claiming the title of apostle, which implies supreme authority.
But he lacked the standard credentials.
Right. He had not followed Jesus during the earthly ministry. He was not trained or authorized by Peter, James, or John. And most damaging of all, he had actively orchestrated the imprisonment and execution of the early believers.
He was literally their worst enemy.
Yeah. To use a modern corporate analogy, Paul's like a fierce rival executive who spent years trying to bankrupt a startup company through hostile litigation.
Yeah.
Then suddenly he switches sides, walks into the building, and claims to be one of their top executives operating with total autonomy.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The audacity is striking.
He has to prove his legitimacy to a highly skeptical board of directors in Jerusalem. And how does he do it? He bypasses the board entirely.
He goes straight to the unreached areas.
Exactly. He expands the market. He takes the hardest, most dangerous assignments in the Gentile provinces where Peter and James have no jurisdiction. He builds an undeniable network of communities, forcing the Jerusalem pillars to retroactively recognize his authority.
That analogy captures the strategic dynamic perfectly. The Jerusalem leaders and rival traveling teachers challenged the legitimacy of Paul's apostleship constantly.
Because he was a liability in their eyes.
Absolutely. Paul met this challenge not by flashing institutional credentials from Jerusalem, but by radically redefining what legitimate leadership looked like. In 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12, Paul presents a staggering argument.
What does he argue there?
He asserts that genuine apostolic leadership is proven not through dominance, but through suffering, weakness, and physical deprivation. He boasts about his beatings, his shipwrecks, his imprisonments, and his physical ailments.
He lists all his traumas as his resume.
Exactly. He readily admits he was one untimely born, as he writes in 1 Corinthians 15, lacking the proper historical prerequisites. Yet, he insists he is a proper apostle because he brought them the message and absorbed massive physical suffering to ensure their survival.
That is a complete paradigm shift.
He bases his authority entirely on the fact that he sacrificed himself for the community, demanding the loyalty that naturally follows that level of dedication.
It is a total reversal of how influence is usually justified in the ancient world. You do not justify your rank by showing your pedigree or your wealth. You justify your rank by showing your scars.
That is beautifully stated. The scars were his credentials.
So we have this core four: Peter, James, John, and Paul. They hold undeniable sway over the movement. But were these four the only ones holding the title of apostle, or did that label extend to a wider circle of leaders?
Well, the term apostle, in its original Greek root apostolos, is functional. It simply refers to a delegate, a messenger, or one who is sent out with a specific commission.
So it wasn't just a restricted theological title from the start?
No, we can trace a clear, deliberate expansion of this term in the texts. Initially, Mark chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 show the commissioning of the 12, who were originally sent specifically to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
The initial localized mission.
Right. But as the movement evolved, that mission expanded to the Gentile nations. And as the mission expanded, so did the use of the term. The book of Acts refers to Barnabas as an apostle alongside Paul.
Okay, so the circle is widening.
It is. Paul himself refers to a pair named Andronicus and Junia as apostles in Romans chapter 16, verse 7.
Hold on, let's look into that specific verse for a second. Junia is a female name.
Yes, it is.
That single name has caused centuries of theological and linguistic debate, hasn't it? Because the implications of a woman holding an apostolic title disrupt a lot of later institutional assumptions.
It disrupts them significantly because the idea of a woman holding an apostolic title was surprising and frankly uncomfortable to later medieval and modern interpreters. Some translators attempted to alter the text.
Wait, they actually tried to change the text itself?
Yes. They tried to read the name with a different accent mark to make it Junius, suggesting it was a male iteration or a nickname. However, textual critic Eldon J. Epp provides a thorough, rigorous argument dismantling that assumption.
What does Epp point out?
Epp demonstrates that Junia, the feminine name, is incredibly common in Roman antiquity and is highly preferred by the manuscript evidence over the completely unattested hypothetical masculine name, Junius.
So Junius as a male name didn't even exist in the records.
Correct. Furthermore, Epp analyzes the Greek phrasing, episemoi en toi apostoa. He argues that the grammar firmly dictates she was outstanding among the apostles, meaning she was a member of the apostolic group, rather than just well known to the apostles from the outside.
Okay, so she was recognized inside the group as an apostle.
Yes, the earliest texts do point to a female apostle. Additionally, scholar Anne Graham Brock points out that Mary Magdalene is widely regarded by scholars as an apostle to the apostles.
Because of her role at the resurrection, right?
Yes. Even though the specific Greek noun isn't applied to her in the gospel texts, her functional role, being the first to witness the resurrection and receiving the direct commission from Christ to proclaim it to the male disciples, matches the exact criteria of apostleship perfectly.
This highlights something crucial. The early movement was far more concerned with function than with honorary titles.
They needed people to do the work regardless of the label.
Right. What is vital for you to understand is that apostle and local leader were not interchangeable concepts. Apostleship was primarily about mobility, proclamation, and planting new communities. They were the regional architects.
They moved from town to town.
Yeah, but once the architect leaves the city, someone has to manage the building. Other leaders had to step up to manage the localized, daily affairs, the finances, and the disputes of the community.
Someone had to stay behind and run the household.
Which brings us to the everyday vocabulary of the Roman world. As these communities settled down, they adopted highly secular common words and used them to describe their local leaders. Let's analyze the specific language of influence they used, starting with the concept of a patron.
Well, the concept of patronage is the invisible engine of the Roman Empire. Roman society ran entirely on reciprocal networks of favors, obligations, and financial backing.
It was how everything got funded.
Absolutely. In Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, Paul names a woman named Phoebe and describes her as a prostatis. In the secular Roman context, a prostatis is a patron, a benefactor, or a legal protector.
Okay, so how did that work inside the church?
Scholar Ritva Williams utilizes a sociological broker-client model to explain how this mechanism functioned within the early church. In this model, God is viewed as the ultimate patron, possessing all spiritual and material wealth.
So God holds the resources.
Yes. The followers are the clients in need of these resources. The local leaders act as brokers, mediating and dispensing the patron's resources to the community.
And Phoebe was one of these brokers.
Yes. As Paul's patron, Phoebe was not just a host. She would have provided substantial material assistance, massive financial backing for his travels, and physical protection using her own civic influence. She leveraged her existing social capital and wealth to assist the group and ensure the risky, precarious mission of the church moved forward.
She was the venture capitalist making the expansion possible. I mean, without a patron like Phoebe funding the travel and securing the meeting spaces, the movement stalls out.
It would have bankrupted itself very quickly.
So, alongside these wealthy patrons, we have other localized functional titles. Let's look at the mechanics of the overseers.
The Greek term is episkopoi. In its earliest secular usage, it carried the broad generic meaning of an inspector, a superintendent, or a guardian.
A very functional, boots-on-the-ground term.
Exactly. We see this generic idea functioning in Acts chapter 20, verse 28, where Paul addresses the existing elders of Ephesus and tells them that the Holy Spirit has made them overseers to care for the flock.
So elder and overseer were somewhat overlapping there.
Yes, the terms are fluid. However, by the time Paul writes his letter to the Philippians, he specifically addresses the overseers and deacons in his greeting, suggesting a slight structural development in that specific city.
A bit more defined.
Yes. When we reach the pastoral epistles, like 1 Timothy and Titus, the role of overseer, which eventually translates into the English word bishop, is a much more established, recognizable office.
And what were they looking for when filling that office?
Scholar John K. Goodrich provides an excellent analysis of the stewardship metaphor found in Titus chapter 1, verse 7. He argues that overseers were appointed specifically because of their demonstrated domestic management skills.
Let's unpack the mechanics of Roman estate management. I mean, what does an overseer actually do in a secular context?
They run the entire household operation.
Right. An estate manager, an oikonomos, is responsible for balancing the ledgers, organizing the labor of slaves and hired workers, resolving internal domestic disputes, ensuring the food supply is secure, and representing the estate in local commerce.
It requires a massive amount of competence.
They have to be incredibly organized, emotionally stable, and practically shrewd. Goodrich is saying the early church looked at those specific, highly competent corporate skill sets and drafted them into religious administration.
That makes perfect logistical sense.
It does. If a man could run a complex Roman household effectively and ethically without resorting to brutal tyranny, he was tasked with managing the household of God.
Spot on. It is a direct transfer of administrative competency. And this brings us to the next functional role, which is the deacons.
Okay, let's talk about the deacons.
The Greek term is diakonoi, which originally meant a generic servant, an attendant, or a courier. The staggering theological weight of this term originates directly from the radical teachings of Jesus. Well, in Mark chapter 10, verse 43, Jesus explicitly defines greatness by acting as a diakonos, an attendant to others, actively subverting the Roman desire for domination.
Flipping the cultural script again.
Yes. We see the practical, localized application of this ideal in Acts chapter 6. The community faces a logistical crisis. The Greek-speaking widows are being neglected in the daily distribution of food.
A real administrative failure.
Right. In response, 7 individuals are appointed specifically to wait on tables, manage the food supply, and ensure the distribution is equitable.
So they were literal food service attendants in that context.
Yes. Paul frequently refers to himself and his co-worker Apollos, using this generic term for servant in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We also see Phoebe, who we mentioned earlier as a patron, simultaneously named as a deacon of the congregation in Cenchrea in Romans chapter 16, verse 1.
She wore multiple hats, it seems.
She did. Eventually, the pastoral epistles solidified this role into a recognized local office that demanded blameless moral character, sobriety, and strong organizational skills to manage the community's charitable resources.
So we have patrons funding the movement, overseers managing the household logistics, and deacons handling the practical distribution of resources. Lastly, we have the elders.
Yes, the presbyteroi. Unlike the previous terms, which draw heavily from Roman secular and domestic life, this concept carried over directly from Jewish synagogue practice.
Circling back to the synagogue model.
Exactly. In that model, the seniority, life experience, and wisdom of older men were highly valued for resolving disputes. Elders are seen operating collectively right alongside the apostles in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 and 16.
Acting as a council of sorts.
Right. In the letter of James, chapter 5, verse 14, the elders are given specific administrative and ritual duties within the local community, such as visiting the sick, praying over them, and anointing them with oil.
Take a step back and look at the sheer audacity of what these early communities were doing. I mean, they did not invent a brand new esoteric religious dictionary.
No, they used the language of the streets and the homes.
Right. They took the everyday job title of an estate manager, the financial backer of a political club, an older wise community member, or a literal attendant waiting tables, and they completely flipped the job description.
They infused secular working-class words with massive theological gravity.
Yes, making mutual care and self-sacrifice the defining metrics of success. But trying to live out these flipped definitions inside a rigid, highly stratified Roman society must have caused intense social friction.
Oh, it caused an immense amount of friction, and that friction is highly visible in the letters themselves, leading to intense modern scholarly debates.
What is the main point of debate there?
The academic debate revolves around the stark tension between the actual practices we see happening in the historical narrative and the strict restrictive commands written in certain letters.
Can you give an example of that tension?
Sure. For example, Romans chapter 16 shows a vibrant culture of mutuality, featuring female leaders, patrons, and apostles like Phoebe and Junia operating with high visibility and influence.
Very active public roles.
Yes. But then you turn a few pages to 1 Corinthians chapters 11 and 14, or 1 Timothy chapter 2, and you find strict, rigid restrictions regarding who is permitted to speak, teach, and hold authority, heavily marginalizing women.
How do scholars analyze and reconcile that glaring tension? Because on one page you have women literally funding the movement and carrying apostolic titles, and on the next page there are commands for absolute silence.
Different scholars offer different analytical lenses to make sense of the contradiction. Loveday Alexander theorizes that this tension reflects the early movement's acute anxieties about their precarious social standing in the Roman Empire.
Anxieties about how they were perceived by outsiders.
Exactly. On one hand, they hold radical underlying theological principles, like Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, which states that in Christ there's no male and female, slave or free.
Which is a beautiful, unifying statement.
It is. On the other hand, acting out that radical social equality publicly could draw the legal, suspicious attention of the Roman authorities. The state viewed any disruption of the paterfamilias structure as outright treason.
So it was a matter of physical safety.
Yes, so the restriction texts might reflect a pragmatic survival mechanism, a deliberate attempt to appear respectable and orderly to hostile outsiders.
Okay, that is one theory. Are there others?
Another scholar, Jeroen Eklund, views the tension as a literal clash of physical spaces. Remember what we discussed earlier? The ecclesia, the assembly of believers, was meeting inside the oikos, the private household.
Living room dynamic again.
Right. This spatial overlap created totally unsettled expectations. In a Roman household, the paterfamilias rules with absolute legal immunity. But in a Christian congregation, spiritual gifting, mutual submission, and the teachings of a crucified Messiah dictate the rules.
Those are completely contradictory operating systems.
They are. When those two opposing realities occupy the identical dining room at the same time, which social rules apply, it caused massive rhetorical unsettledness.
It is the ultimate collision of public civic law, crashing right into private living room dynamics. They're trying to build a totally new kind of community based on the self-giving love of their Messiah, while the Roman Empire is literally staring through the windows, demanding order, hierarchy, and submission to the state.
That tension is palpable in every letter Paul writes.
And this friction explains why the letter sounds so different depending on who Paul is writing to and what crisis he is trying to put out.
And this brings up a critical analytical point raised by scholars Todd Penner and Davina Lopez. They assert that recognizing the rhetorical, situational nature of these letters is vital for historical accuracy.
We have to read them in context.
Yes. Paul and the other early writers were constantly negotiating between Roman imperial norms and the newness found in their faith. When modern readers study these ancient texts and try to extract a rigid, timeless corporate manual for modern leadership, they often end up confronting their own modern assumptions about gender, authority, and institutional structure.
We tend to read our modern boardrooms back into their ancient dining rooms.
We do. The New Testament letters are occasional documents. They were written hastily to address specific, localized crises, behavioral issues, and theological disputes in cities like Corinth or Ephesus. We have to read them as dynamic, real-time responses to a complex, shifting geopolitical world, rather than static legal codes.
That is an excellent way to synthesize the sheer scale of the history we've covered today. To recap this massive historical landscape, we started by tracing the seismic shift from the temple priests holding a total monopoly on authority to the necessary rise of the synagogue sages after the devastating destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE.
It was complete reinvention of community life.
Then we analyzed how the early Christ movement took root in the fertile yet incredibly tense intersection of Roman household management structures and Jewish kinship models. We examined the controversial rise of Paul, who bypassed the traditional board of directors by taking his mission to the margins.
Relying on his scars instead of a pedigree.
Right. We watched as every day working-class words like overseer and deacon evolved into highly respected community offices based on character and practical labor rather than bloodline. And finally, we looked at the very real friction caused by attempting to live out radical equality within a heavily stratified lethal empire.
It has been a really fascinating discussion.
It has. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We have seen that the highest offices in the early church started as functional working-class terms, like a steward managing an estate or an attendant waiting tables to ensure widows didn't starve.
Real, practical, on-the-ground labor.
Exactly. If that is the origin of religious authority, how does that alter the way you look at the fancy titles, the rigid hierarchies, and the corner offices in our own modern institutions? When we evaluate leadership today, are we prioritizing the title or the towel? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep reading the primary sources, and keep investigating the historical roots of the things you take for granted.
Thank you for listening. May you continue to seek wisdom, historical clarity, and truth in all your studies. Farewell.